Welcome, everyone. I have 12 Eastern, 11 Central, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Tanya Short. I'm the Health and Human Sciences Educator with Purdue Extension in Knox County, and I'm joined by my colleague, Kristen Lowry. Give the folks a wave, Kristen, or unmute and say hi.
Good morning. Hope you guys are all doing well. If you have any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat, and I will be monitoring that and getting back with Tanya on any and all of your questions.
Okay, awesome. Thanks, Kristen. And it's always kind of a juggling scenario when you're hosting on the back end of one of these things, so I won't necessarily be able to see that chat box. We do have a fairly small group today, though, so if you feel like you just would rather unmute and speak your question, feel free to do that as well. And so let's go ahead and get started. So as for any of you who have participated in our sessions before, you know that we are part of the National Cooperative Extension Service, which is a nationwide network focusing on research, education, and outreach into the communities. And this is established in every state in the country, and in Indiana, this is operated by virtue of Purdue University. And so this is a cooperation of federal, state, university, and college partners or county partnerships that help make this happen. And in Indiana, we are very proud that we have county-based offices in all of our 92 counties. Teaching in concepts of ag and natural resources, community development, 4-H and youth development, and health and human sciences, which is where myself and my team fall. Another piece that we try to do with all of our programming is to have short and hopefully painless evaluations, trying to get your feedback not only to the content, but also to the quality of that delivery to help us improve for next time. Your feedback is very important to us. So when we drop that slide in the chat box at the end of the session today, please hop on over and complete that for us. So today we are going to be talking about dieting, thinking about how do we evaluate diet fads, how do we identify components of a healthful eating plan. Hopefully I can trigger you to identify barriers to maintaining that healthful eating plan that you strive for, and develop a plan for overcoming those barriers. And then lastly, hopefully I'll be able to share with you some nutrition related resources that you may not have been aware of already. And so with that, go ahead and get a pen and paper, because I do always hope that you have at least one thing that you learned that is worth writing down. And let's go ahead and find a comfy position. For those of you who have participated in my sessions before, you know I like to start with some deep breathing exercises, just because the more and more I'm in this health education role, I am recognizing and respecting the tie that we find between our mental health and our cognitive state of being and our ability to focus on our everyday tasks at hand. So with that, let's just go ahead and get comfy and take a deep breath in. Hold it at the top for 1, 2, 3, and then exhale all the way out. Let's do that again. Deep breath in. Hold at the top, 1, 2, 3, and exhale. Let's do that one more time. Deep breath all the way in. Hold at the top, 1, 2, 3, and exhale. That was very brief. Almost too brief for my liking. I could have done that much longer, but hopefully you can feel a difference even just from those 3 focused deep breaths. So in order for us to get started, I would like to know if you have dieted in the past year, and if yes, did you follow a specific diet plan? Or if you aren't in those categories, if you said no, like what do you think is the most popular diet? Like, what do you hear your friends talking about? What do you hear your neighbors talking about? And go ahead and unmute or just drop that in the chat box for me. I'm seeing low carb, keto, which is another low carb, extremely low carb, just counting calories in general. Joe, I'm glad you commented about that eating plan because you're going to hear that from me quite a bit today. So good introduction there. So let me just share with you. This is from the 2020 Food and Health Survey by the International Food Information Council. And so they do a survey every year. And this showed that 58% of respondents between the ages of 18 to 34 reported dieting in the past year. And that the majority of them were folks who had children. So if you have kids, maybe you can come up with your own reason of why that might be differentiated between parents and non-parents, but here we have it. And then the types of diet that they reported following in the tops of those lists are either some sort of fasting or calorie restriction or low carb restriction as well. So kind of just what you guys were sharing and seeing as trends. And so, and again, in the chat box, what do you think is the top reason people diet, or what was your motivation if you wanted to share that? Lose weight, weight loss, have more energy. So some sort of combination of weight loss and feeling better. I love that, Megan. You want to live longer, better life. So we're extending our lifespan, but what do those last years look like? Are they the best quality? Yeah. And thinking about our kids too. Absolutely, Kristen. Yeah. So hopefully I can implore you, if you make only one change, that you do it just strictly for the purpose of role modeling to our kids, right? So let's take a peek here at this next chart. So this again was from that same survey I just shared. And their top motivator was wanting to lose weight, wanting to feel better, have more energy, wanting to improve their physical appearance. And so those were right in line with what you all shared as well. So I'm going to switch gears here a little bit and talk about U.S. News and World Health Report. Every year they do an analysis, or they solicit an analysis from experts of what the best diets of the previous year were. And so this year they ranked somewhere in the 40s of the diets, and some of them were so bad they didn't even make the list. Some of them were so good they floated all the way top to number one. I will say that these are ranked based on 7 categories. Number one, in no particular order, how easy they are to follow, their ability to produce short-term and long-term weight loss, their nutritional completeness of the diet, its safety and potential for preventing and managing diseases such as diabetes and heart disease. So depending on how well each of these diets scored in those different categories is where they ended up falling on this ranking. And here I went through and put these all into a list for you. You can see at the bottom of that list is the diets that are highly restrictive, the Atkins, the keto, and the paleo, which had its heyday. You can still find here and there, which is highly restrictive. But if you look at this top 10 list, these are really not even almost what I would consider diets. These are more eating plans or patterns, like Joe commented on there in the beginning when we were talking about what kinds of diets do you follow. And the thing that these highly restrictive diets all have in common is that they're really hard to sustain long term. And that's one of the reasons they end up being down at the bottom of the list. And so one of the things that I want to encourage folks is, and the other thing about highly restricted diets is that once we revert back to our regular eating habits, the weight comes back, right? And we end up in this cycle. And so one of the things that I really want to encourage folks is to think about reframing the way we think about diet or defining diet. So the primary ways that we use this word is as a verb, in that I am dieting, I am restricting myself of the types of certain types of food, or to use it again as a noun, but it's still that same concept as a restrictive eating pattern that we are doing for a couple of different reasons, but most typically to lose weight. I would encourage you, oh dear, I would encourage you to reframe the way you think about that, to think about my diet is what I do every day. It's my eating habit, it's my eating plan, it's what I do as a habit to nourish my body. It's that food or drink I regularly consume. And so with that, I would like to ask you, how many of you have heard of the My Plate eating plan? And I can't see you raise your hands. I don't have video in front of me, so I'm gonna assume you're all, maybe half of you are nodding yes and half no.
Oh. Lots of great reactions by many guests that have all heard of it, or it seems like all but maybe a couple have heard of this.
Okay. So this originated around, thank you, Kristen. This originated around 2010 and is replaced by the food pyramid, which I'm sure many of us remember from our school years. And this is a visual representation of what a healthy eating plan should look like. And as you can see at a glance, this is includes all 5 food groups. And I want to emphasize that this is supported by mountains of research collated by leading health and nutrition experts. And as I noted, the diets that scored poorly on that list I showed you previously are the ones that are more restrictive. And in fact, many of them cut out entire foods or entire food groups, which, if carried out in the long term, can actually lead to nutrient deficiencies, among many other possible complications. And so one of the key measures of the healthfulness of any diet plan is if it cuts out entire foods or food groups. For us today, though, in order to convince you of this, rather than examine each food group, I want to take a look at this from the nutrient perspective and why a balanced eating plan that includes all food groups is critically important. And so I want to focus on the 3 macronutrients, which are where our source of energy or our source of calories come from. And that is carbohydrates, which we will find in our fruits, our grains, dairy, beans, and even some starchy vegetables. Protein, which comes from meat, fish, poultry, eggs, and beans. And even though dairy and grains are not typically considered a protein food, they do provide a minimal to moderate amount of protein, which, considering that none of us really need as much protein as the media would lead us to believe, it actually adds up to quite a bit, and we don't want to overlook that. And then lastly, our fats. So both our unsaturated, which is our oils, they're things that are liquid at room temperature, and our saturated fat, which comes from animal products, animal fat, butter, and items that are fats that are solid at room temperature. And so I want to start here with carbohydrates, because this seems to be the macronutrient that gets the most grief, at least in recent years, from dieters and people trying to demonize certain foods or food groups. So carbohydrates are the body's favorite source of fuel. They are most easily converted to glucose, which is the form of carbs that our body burns for energy. In fact, even when our body burns other macronutrients for fuel, such as fat or protein, and we'll talk about that a little bit later, but they still have to be converted to glucose first. And this is a much harder process, and it can actually have negative side effects like muscle loss. Not something we all want to sign up for, right? So expecting our body to go without carbs and use only protein and fat for fuel is like putting unrefined oil in our car and expecting it to be able to convert the oil to gasoline before first being able to start the engine. Now, here's the thing. Our body is highly adaptable and can do that, but it does not prefer to have to do that, and it will have negative consequences in the long term. Moreover, carbohydrate-rich sources are not only the body's optimal source of fuel, they also contain other critical nutrients that most Americans do not get enough of, fiber being one of those. Fiber plays many important roles, including helping us feel fuller longer while adding virtually no calories. It's also a key player in maintaining digestive and colon health. And moreover, when you eat a wide variety of carb-containing foods, especially bright-colored fruits and vegetables, you can ensure you are getting all the different micronutrients, our vitamins and minerals, that we need to fuel everyday body activities like helping wounds heal, allowing our heart to pump efficiently, and keeping our nervous system protected and healthy. So, what does this mean for us calorically and when we're thinking about weight loss? Carbohydrates contain 4 calories per gram, and it's estimated that we should have about 45 to 65% of our daily calories come from carbohydrates. So I've done some calculations here on the screen for you just so you could see kind of a rough gauge of what this might look like. So for someone who needs 2,000 calories a day, that adds up on the low end to needing approximately 225 grams of carb per day, up to around 325. Now, just to put this in perspective, very low carb diets like the ketogenic diet prescribe for 20 grams of carbs a day. So virtually none. For another perspective, typical recommendations for diabetics who must control their carb intake because of their disease status, right, still are typically recommended to consume an average of 150 carbs a day. So this is a very critical nutrient for our body to fuel itself. A last note that I want to make about carbohydrates is that the central nervous system, which includes our brain, utilizes about 50% of our daily glucose intake. So not giving your body a source of glucose is effectively starving your brain, and your body will begin to break down protein in order to provide that needed glucose. And as I mentioned earlier, breaking down protein, that means breaking down your muscle, and we definitely want to prevent that. So I saw the chat box flashing, but I can't actually read it. So I'm going to pause right there and see if there's anything that Kristen needs to share.
No, Janet was just sharing that our workshops are shared within their company in their health weekly newsletter. So that's great to know.
Oh, awesome. Yes. Thank you, Janet. So next, thinking about protein. So this is literally the body's building block. Proteins are made up of components called amino acids, and there are 20 amino acids. 11 of them are non-essential, meaning that our body can produce them all by themselves, without us having to get them from any other sources. However, the other 9 are essential, which means our body cannot produce them and we must consume them from food. Animal products are considered to be complete proteins because they contain all of the amino acids we need, while plant proteins do not and are considered incomplete proteins. For this reason, persons restricting intake of animal products must take care to consume a wide variety of plant-based proteins in order to get all of the essential amino acids. It can be done. You just have to take care in your meal planning. Proteins have many roles in the body, the most well of which is known for growth and maintenance. Proteins are integral parts of most body structures, including skin, tendons, organs, muscles, and bones. And they also support growth and repair of body tissue, so really critical in healing. Other roles of protein can include acting as enzymes, which facilitate other chemical reactions, assisting with blood clotting. They act as hormones, for example, growth hormones, and the hormone insulin, which help regulate blood sugar levels, are both proteins. Proteins are used to regulate fluid and pH balance in the body. They act as transporters, carrying nutrients and molecules throughout the body. And they also form antibodies, which identify and attack foreign invading cells like viruses. We're thinking a lot about antibodies these days too, as well, right? So those are proteins. So what about protein as a source of fuel? It absolutely is. So protein contains 4 calories per gram, and protein is constantly being turned over in the body, broken down and replaced. Despite being so critical for a multitude of bodily functions, in the absence of carbohydrates, the body will break down protein into glucose for that needed fuel. The cost here, I will say it again, is muscle loss. While recommendations are that approximately 10 to 35% of our calories come from protein, calculating our protein needs based on body weight is actually more in alignment with our actual needs. So the standard recommendation for protein intake for a healthy individual is 8 grams per kilogram of body weight. And I try to do the calculations for you on screen here just so you can get an idea of what that converts to. So if we have a 150-pound person, that equates to about 54 grams of protein that we need per day. Now, what does that look like food-wise? Well, first we have to keep in mind that 1 ounce of protein food, so an ounce of meat, for example, has 7 grams of protein in it. So 54 grams of protein equals approximately less than 8 ounces of protein food. So whether that's the meat, the fish, the dairy, the eggs, the supplemental sources that we get from our grains, all add up to this amount that provides really what we need to do all of those processes in the body. And to think that we go out to eat and we order an 8 or a 16-ounce steak for a single meal, right? And if you don't, I'm sure you know someone who does. So moving on to our third macronutrient, which is fat. So friend or foe, it's been all over the place in the decades of research. You know, we went through a period where the fat was the enemy and we tried to do low fat or no fat everything, and that caused us to tip into being a carb heavy eating pattern. And now we're coming to realize that there is definitely some benefits in fat, and that we need to just be cautious about the type of fat that we're consuming. So as I said earlier, you know, saturated fat tends to come from our animal products. Our unsaturated fats come from our plant oils and other plant products. And fat, here's the reason why it got demonized so heavily, is it really packs a calorie punch. At 9 calories per gram, it gives you more than double the calories of carbohydrates and proteins. So I want to break this down just a little bit more. So saturated fat is actually linked with higher cholesterol numbers and an increased risk of cardiovascular disease and overall increased inflammation. On the other side of that coin, unsaturated fat is linked to anti-inflammatory properties and can actually promote increases in healthy cholesterol levels, so our HDL, our happy cholesterol. What research has found is that when we broadly limit fat, regardless of type, the results really don't show anything. But when we place restrictions only on our saturated fat, but still include healthy levels of unsaturated fat, we see improvements in body weight. We see improvements in lipid profiles that measure our cardiovascular disease risk. So things like looking at our triglycerides, our cholesterol, our LDL, our HDL. But I would also point out that when we take out those saturated fats and we replace them with a carb-heavy diet, that doesn't do us any benefit at all, and that can actually be just as bad, if not worse. So we really have to think about, if we're trying to remove something from our diet, what are we replacing it with? And so I would say here, again, 10 to 35% of our calories should come from fat. If we break this down from a person who requires 2,000 calories a day, what does that look like? Anywhere between 22 to 77 grams of fat per day. Now, keep in mind that if you consume 77 grams of fat a day, you are getting over a third of your calories from fat, and you're going to have to really be careful with what you're eating the rest of the day in order to stay within your calorie needs to not gain weight. And just to put this in perspective, a Hostess cupcake, you know, they're not very big. A little cupcake has 6 grams of fat. So it adds up fast when we're thinking about some of these processed and prepared baked foods. So what does that look like? You know, I put a calorie range on each of those, 45 to 65 for carbs, 10 to 35 for fat and protein. What does it look like? Well, it could really be any mix of these. But this is not necessarily where I want you to focus. I just wanted to emphasize the role of each of those macronutrients and why we shouldn't be eliminating any food or food groups. But to simplify what this would look like, I want to spend the rest of our time together talking about some tools that the My Plate Plan has recently published. So I would ask you, on a scale of 1 to 100 in the chat box, how would you say that your current eating habits measure up? How would you rank your current eating habits? With 1 being like they could not get any worse, I'm eating fast food every day, every meal, to 100, they couldn't get any better, everyone should model their life after me. And if you get 100, I will probably hire you to come start cooking for me. And let's see if I can find my chat box here. Oh, Megan, I'm sure you didn't really mean to put a 6, did you?
I thought it was out of 10.
Oh, yeah. 90, 50, 50, 75 to 100, 85, 90. Yeah. So you guys are in the upper 3/4, doing pretty good there. So
I wonder if right now people are eating out less and that's also helping you to be more aware of what you're eating.
That's a good point, Kristen. That's a very good point. Yeah, and I should point out that these statistics that I have been sharing, this survey from the International Food Council was actually done on February 4th and 5th of 2020. It was a survey that was sent out. And so it's hard to say, right? Especially depending on what part of the country you were in, if you responded to this, like what the impacts of the pandemic could have had on the way you were feeling at that time. But let me just say that generally speaking, and this is true for really a lot of things in life, we tend to think that we are doing better than everyone else around us. So 86% of people with a college degree believe their diet is healthier than the average person. And people rate their healthfulness on average, however, at a 59, while ranking their neighbors as a 42. So, but what does this really look like? So these numbers, this is based on the Healthy Eating Index scores that ranks between 1 and 100. And as you can see here, regardless of age group that you are in, pretty much none of us are really killing it as much as we think we are, right? So with older adults age 60 plus having the highest Healthy Eating Index score, teenagers, we can probably guess why, have the lowest, right? And those middle-aged folks, like the rest of us, us working-age folks, we know the barriers there is to put a healthy meal a balanced meal on the table every day. So as I've said before, one of the ways that we can measure our eating habits is to measure it against the My Plate eating plan. So I'm going to have Kristen drop a link in the chat box for you, and I want you to hop on over there and take this quiz really quickly. It shouldn't take but 3 or 4 minutes. And so I should have had some like soothing music for you while you're doing that. So I guess as you finish, if you can drop something in the chat box to let me know. And so I'm guessing that at least a couple of you have made it all the way through to the end there. I see one comment that says, I'm doing great in all areas, but not sure I really feel that way. So what this did, if there were any of you who weren't able to get to it, so it asks you the frequency that you eat each of the different food groups, so fruits, vegetables, grains, breaking down total versus whole grains, protein, breaking down the different types of proteins, if you follow a vegetarian diet, what types of dairy do you use, and then it also gives you an option to select different kind of resources that you want, which are pretty neat as well. They've been adding a lot of new stuff to this website in the last 3 to 6 months, I would say. And so here's kind of what it's going to look like when you find it. And I will tell you that I got flagged on my vegetable and my protein foods when I did this quiz, and I can tell you exactly why. Number 1, I don't eat enough beans, peas, or legumes. I'm probably only once a week maybe on those. Maybe, you know, it depends. It cycles, actually. But then on my protein foods, I know I definitely don't have seafood or fish twice a week. It's probably more like 3 times a month. And so those are the places where they're recommended for me to improve. Is there any other thoughts or comments before I move on to the next section on what feedback you got when you took that quiz?
Joe had an interesting comment just saying that her eating habits improved once she was an empty nester and she didn't have children in the home. I know for myself, one thing that I had to change was anything being set out for you to see on a daily basis. So fruit's always sitting out at our house, but we don't have like a tower of snacks. And I know just speaking from other friends that do that, not so much that it would necessarily even be the kids. It might be myself or my spouse that would be going to go eat those snacks that would be sitting around all the time. Because if I would buy a box of Debbie cakes, we're all going to eat the box of Debbie cakes. So sometimes just being mindful too when you're going to the grocery store, or even if you're doing Instacart, sometimes that's best too, because you're not buying all of those add-ins and putting those in your cart because they look good or they sound good because you're hungry at that point in time. So great tip there, Joe.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks to both of you for sharing. And I've actually heard a lot of people say that they liked doing the online grocery shopping because for that exact reason, Kristen, because it prevented those kind of impulse purchases. So if you finish your quiz and you scroll down a little bit more, you're going to see on the left here, it says Start Simple with My Plate app. So this code can actually be plugged into their app and it will sync up your recommendations with that app. But what I want you to look at now is the center there where it says My Plate Plan. And I'm going to have Kristen drop that link in the chat box again, because it's one thing to know, okay, this is how many servings of everything I should be eating, but what is actually our calorie needs for our body? Because that's ultimately where weight loss comes from. We have to have that calorie deficit. And so I'm going to have you jump on over real quick. You can either click that, if you finished your quiz, you can either click where it says start right there, or you can follow that link that Kristen dropped in the chat box. And this takes just probably 30 seconds to enter your calculations. Because what it does actually is it asks you for your age, your gender, your height and weight and physical activity level, because these are all the components that are going to go into what our daily calorie needs are. And so for this person that I put in to get this screenshot, you can see that they need approximately 2,200 calories per day to maintain their current weight. Now, this is pretty sly here. If you look above that, it says 2,000 calories to achieve a healthy weight. So it's kind of their coy way of saying this person could stand to lose a pound or two. It's really good to know, and it's really important to know where we stand in our calorie needs, so that when we get to this screen where we did where we get our recommendations, we know not only the quantity in cup sizes, but what does that look like in calories? And what should we be shooting for either that weight maintenance or that weight loss? And so you might think, oh my gosh, I cannot get all those food groups. So I would encourage you to kind of zoom out a little bit and think about this in terms of our meals and snacks. So how would you plug each of those food groups in to your breakfast, lunch, dinner, and snack times in order to fit them in throughout the day? And I would challenge you that if you really thought about your meal planning in this way, you would find that trying to fit in that Hostess cake or trying to fit in that fill in the blank, that thing that you grab because you haven't planned, right? Kind of suddenly just falls off the board and no longer becomes as much of an issue anyway. So the last thing I want to talk about here, and hopefully we can get a little bit of a discussion here, is what are your primary barriers to keeping your diet related resolutions? What were the I can't do that thoughts that came to your mind while I was presenting? Nobody has barriers. They're all knocking it out of the park. Well, I will just tell you then.
I will be human and throw one out there. My biggest thing is working from home. I am not as apt to eat breakfast and get my day started. And if we're in a complete routine like normal and going to school and everything, then that very much just happens. And staying in routines are good for us at our house to stay healthier.
Absolutely. And so, Kristen, you've hit on two things that they actually talked about that very first week of this series. We were talking about making goals and generals. One, be aware of our cues. So what kind of food is sitting out on your table to catch your eye? And two, what's your routine, right? And if you want to make a change, how do you make that your routine? So looking again, this is that same survey from the International Food Council that was done in very early February of last year. So not sure if the pandemic could have had any influence on this, but their number one was feeling stress. The second one, followed by a tie, actually in second place, is that it takes time, right? It takes time to plan, it takes time to cook. So the next two barriers listed were finding the changes restrictive or very expensive, being very busy, or being very hungry, right? And that comes back to planning. Because if we don't plan our meals and our snacks, we get hungry, we do those impulse purchases, we grab the snack cake that's on the counter, etc. So what is one thing that you can think about that has been a barrier to you or that's been a hang up? And what is something you could do that's a realistic thing to think about doing to overcome that barrier?
Tanya, we had another comment that was sent privately and just saying that a difficulty they have is the food prepping with young children and how hard that can sometimes be.
Yes, especially if they're picky eaters. I realize everybody's story is different. Everybody's children are different. But for me, when I stopped preparing the second meal for my son and said, you're going to eat what mom cooked. We're not having separate meals. Like, it took him a while, but he finally came around, and I have him help me meal plan. I will give him no more than 3 options for each, and he knows that he has to choose his meat or his protein, whatever that's going to be, 2 vegetables and a fruit. And if I don't give him enough options, he will tell me, Mom, there is not 2 vegetables in the choices you just gave me. So they will catch on, but it's hard on our end, right, to be consistent about that, to really nail it home with them. Anybody else have a tip on how you can get kids to be more engaged so that becomes less of a challenge?
I think inviting them into the kitchen just to do the food prep. So at a very young age, after you've even just cleaned grapes, for example, at 18 months to 2 years old, that was something I had my children start to learn. And that's fine motor skills too, of pulling the vegetables or the fruit off. But as they get older, my older child is having to learn how to use a knife. Well, it's a lot better if he's right there with myself and learning than discovering on his own. So that might be something that smaller vegetables or something that's easier like celery would be an option there, not so much like carrots. But just having them to see what you're doing, and then they'll be more prideful in eating that later.
Absolutely. And there's a lot of evidence in that behind the value of that practice. And I saw a couple other people talking about prepping and planning ahead of time, meal prep on the weekends. So all great ideas. So I just have a couple of final parting thoughts for you when thinking about dieting, and that is that our body, your body, will work against you. If you give it less calories, it will adapt and learn to use less. And this is when, remember that physical activity is your friend. And so if you joined us 2 weeks ago for our Move More segment, they talked about the value of both cardio and strength training as part of our regular physical activity routine. And so this is important for a couple of reasons. One thing is it's going to help maintain our basal metabolic rate. So the amount of calories that our body needs just to be alive, just to rest, just to take a nap. So the higher we can keep that number, the more calories we're going to burn, right? So physical activity is what's going to help you keep that number higher. Number 2, we want to build muscle. This is for a couple of reasons. One, if we're dieting, we're at risk for breaking down that protein for muscle loss. And so we want to preserve that muscle so that that doesn't happen. But also muscle burns more calories. So we are going to necessarily increase our base metabolic rate just by having more muscles. And then lastly, people who have a regular, consistent exercise routine are actually more likely to stick to their eating plan. Now, this could be physiological, biological, because it helps regulate our hunger hormones, or it could also be more psychological in that, man, if I just got up an hour early so that I could exercise today, am I really going to undo all of that by indulging in whatever, right? So I would posit that it's a little bit of both, but either way, we do know that there's a strong link between those who exercise regularly and being able to stick to the eating plan they made for themselves. So I think someone earlier in the chat box said something about tracking their food. This is a really, really important component for weight loss and maintenance, because if I asked you what you had for breakfast, or if I asked you to write down and do a 24-hour food recall of everything you ate yesterday, like how confident are you that you could actually remember every single thing you ate? I'm guessing that most of us could not, unless you have a really structured, like planned out eating plan. There's probably something you're going to miss because it's human nature, right? So tracking your food can help you know if you're staying on track with your calorie and your nutrient needs. And then lastly, for weight loss and weight maintenance, the thing we find with these very restrictive diets is that they will give you very excellent short-term weight loss results. But the thing that we find, regardless of the type of diet, if it's low fat, if it's low carb, whatever, if it's intermittent fasting, if you 1 and 2 and 5 years out, the weight is all been gained back and then some, because there was no maintenance plan. We did our calorie deficit, we lost the weight, and then we went back to our previous way of eating and undid it all. And then that's how we end up in that cycle. So we have to have them, if you choose to do any sort of dieting for the purpose of that immediate weight loss, what is your long-term eating plan gonna be so that it doesn't come back? And I would just like to share, and I would invite anyone, if they have other apps they have used, to share these, but here's a couple that I have tried in the past. MyFitnessPal and my Net Diary, they're both going to produce something that looks like what the image on the right here, where it helps track your number of calories. It helps break it down into the macronutrients so you can kind of see that balance. There's even another screen where you can dig deeper into the micronutrients, the vitamins and the minerals. It is a little tedious to track it all, right? So maybe you don't want to do that long term. Maybe you want to do it for a week, 5 days, just to kind of get a feel. I wouldn't even ask you to change your eating habits during this time. Just track everything that you're eating without changing anything, just to really get a true feel of how many calories you are eating every day and where they're falling at. And you can say, man, I had a lot of fat today. I was way over. Like, what did that come from? And be able to kind of go back and look at your food diary, your food log, to figure out what's going on. If you prefer something simpler, I will tell you that My Plate just launched a new app this summer called Start Simple with My Plate. And I really love this because it's so basic. It simply tracks the food groups, they help keep it broad level, and they give you really simple prompts and tips on how you can get more of certain food groups into your diet. So I like, it's a very appropriate title, that it really is just starting simple and staying simple. And so that one is free. I do believe the other two are probably free to a certain extent, but then if you want the extra features, there's usually a fee. Are there any other apps or any other tips or tricks, tools that you all have used to help track your food or to help stay on track? Okay, well, hearing none and seeing nothing in the chat box, I would just open this up one last time for discussion. And what will you do? Can you identify changes that you want to make to optimize your eating habits? Can you identify changes to remove any potential barriers in achieving those changes? I'm assuming you logged on for a reason today, so like, what were you thinking? What were you hoping to learn? And how can we help you get there? And the other thing I would ask you is that when you think about the changes that you want to make, how confident are you that you can implement those? And that kind of goes back with the identifying your barriers. Oh, I see a comment from someone that they also use MyFitnessPal, and that meal planning is a challenge. I do have a scale that I use for certain foods. That's the thing about portion sizes. You know, you actually do have to measure it out or weigh it or whatever to really understand what a cup or 3/4 cup of a cereal looks like. But then once you pour it into the typical bowl you use in the mornings, you can kind of begin to get a gauge, an estimation, to where that doesn't have to be necessarily a permanent part of your meal planning every day.
Another suggestion that was sent in privately was just also thinking about, and I agree, when you do feel hungry, if portion control is difficult for you, know what foods you can take seconds on, and that's going to be helpful to yourself, whether that's the vegetables or even going with your protein versus grabbing for a dessert. Or if you have a habit of eating something sweet right before you go to bed, maybe trying to transfer that out with something else, like a scoop of peanut butter or something of that nature, to get yourself some protein before you go to sleep.
Absolutely. And so, and to be able to figure all of that out, one of the steps to get there is really tracking your food so that you can see, oh, this could be where I'm sabotaging myself with all of my eating habits and plans. You know what, Karen, that's funny. So she wrote, a wise woman once told me that if I'm not hungry enough to eat an apple, then I am not hungry. And that's one of the things, I was actually just getting ready to say that because I do that with my son. My parents love him to death, but they have taught my child that we need dessert after every meal. So one of the things I have to ask him is, are you still hungry? Then, you know, what of the other things that are already on the table do you want seconds of, right? Because dessert is a treat. It's, you know, just a taste, a sampling, not to fill us up, right? And I love what Jo said as well, is when she was trying to decrease the amount of meat she consumed, that she ended up filling it in with grains and beans and other things that she had not typically been getting enough of. So that was an excellent switch there. Okay. Well, if you don't have any further comments or questions.
One more.
Sure.
One more question that came in here, Tanya, for you. So after they do the meal planning and prepping and they have leftovers, they feel as if they need to not waste anything and make sure that they eat it because they have put so much time and effort into that. Do you have any suggestions for that?
So it's going to depend on how big your family is and how much food was left over, right? Can you have a leftover day where you have 1 to 2 servings of everything? Like Thursday is leftover day and you each get to pick. So it saves you from having to cook that night and the leftovers get eaten. The other thing is if you just have one or 2 servings left over of something, if you take your food or if you take your lunch to work, can you go ahead and package that up into a microwave safe container and take it with you to work? And again, now you've got a nutritious meal for lunch that you didn't have to cook. You can't hardly beat that.
Another suggestion I would have too, because those are awesome suggestions and we always do have leftovers and I'm blessed everyone here will eat them. I know that's sometimes an issue, but you can change the meal depending on what it is. You know, some people that if you think back to how they might have cooked 20, 30 years ago and you think, okay, so one time I've have a rotisserie chicken and then the next day we've had tacos with that, or we also could make some type of soup with it too. So maybe thinking how resourceful you can use those meals to make a different type of meal. But we have a couple other things, meal prepping in different parts like chicken and rice to put different meals together. And another suggestion was maybe to freeze it. If you have quite a bit left over, maybe to freeze it rather than have it as the leftovers.
Absolutely. I would agree with all of that. So Kristen, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and drop the link for the survey in the chat box. And while she does that, I will just remind everyone that we did do a session on meal prepping either in October, I think. So you'll be able to find that on our YouTube channel, or we are certainly happy to do that session again if everyone feels like they could benefit from that. So if everyone would pop over and click on that link that Kristen just put in the chat box. It's super short and sweet. I appreciate your feedback. And while you're doing that, I will just share that next month is our financial fitness series. So we're thinking about decluttering our paper. How do we know what to keep? And tips and tricks for managing that paper pile. We're going to have a guest speaker from Brown, Smith, and Settle out of Vanderburgh County talking about prepping for tax time. February 15th, we will take a look at scams and identity theft, and then we will finish up the series talking about America Saves Week and some different ways that we can put a little extra money in savings even if we don't think we have enough to save.